You know what they say about fixing cars and fixing marriages? Both require getting your hands dirty, and both usually end up costing more than you planned. My name's Anthony Miller, and after 20 years of turning wrenches and 14 years of marriage, I can tell you that statement's truer than a laser-cut gasket. I was elbow deep in a transmission rebuild when my wife Brooke decided to drop her little bombshell. Not literally into the transmission, mind you, though that might have been less messy than what actually happened. Tony, we need to talk about Kyle coming to stay with us. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. I looked up from the valve body I was inspecting, wiping my hands on a shop rag that had seen better decades. Brooke stood in the doorway of my auto shop, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. Kyle, her brother. The same Kyle who'd been between jobs for the better part of 2 years and had a talent for making every family gathering feel like a hostage situation. Stay with us how long? I asked, though I already knew I wasn't going to like the answer. Just until he gets back on his feet. Maybe a few months. A few months. In our 2-bedroom house, with Kyle's charming habit of treating our refrigerator like his personal all-night diner and our living room like his private man cave. I set down my tools and really looked at my wife. Brooke was still pretty at 34, with that blonde hair she spent more on monthly than I made in a week. But there was something in her expression I'd been seeing more often lately, a kind of impatient dismissal, like I was a customer trying to negotiate labor costs. Brooke, last time Kyle stayed with us, he left beer cans under the couch for 3 weeks after he moved out, and that's not even mentioning what he did to our water bill. He's family, Tony. Family helps family. There it was. The conversation ender. Family. Like I wasn't family. Like the guy who'd been paying the mortgage and keeping food on the table was just some roommate who happened to share her bed. Fine, I said, because what else was I going to say? But he follows house rules. No friends over after 10, he cleans up after himself, and he contributes to groceries. Brooke's smile was the kind you give a child who's finally agreed to eat his vegetables. You're the best, honey. Kyle will be so grateful. She left, and I went back to my transmission. Funny thing about transmissions, when they start slipping, you can usually feel it coming for weeks before they finally give out completely. The shifts get rough, there's hesitation when you need power, and eventually you're stuck on the side of the road wondering how you missed all the warning signs. 2 days later, Kyle moved in. Kyle Maddox was one of those guys who peaked in high school and spent the next 20 years trying to convince everyone he was still the star quarterback. At 36, he had the soft gut of a man who talked about his glory days while drinking beer on someone else's couch. He'd been a cop for about 5 minutes after high school before washing out, and since then had bounced between security jobs and unemployment with the regularity of a metronome. Tony, my man, he announced, dropping 2 garbage bags and a duffel onto our living room floor. Thanks for letting me crash here. This is just temporary, you know. Got some big opportunities coming up. Kyle always had big opportunities coming up. They just never seemed to actually arrive. The first week wasn't terrible. Kyle made an effort to clean up after himself, even contributed $40 toward groceries. He told stories about his latest security gig at a downtown office building, making it sound like he was single-handedly protecting Fort Knox instead of checking badges and making sure the coffee machine didn't get vandalized. But I noticed things. The way Brooke laughed at Kyle's stories, really laughed, not the polite chuckle she'd been giving my jokes lately. How she started making bigger dinners and asking Kyle what he wanted to watch on TV. How she'd sit next to him on the couch while I was in my chair. The 3 of us arranged like some weird domestic triangle. Kyle's really turning his life around, she told me one night as we got ready for bed. He's got an interview next week with a private security firm. Real money. That's great, I said, though I'd heard about Kyle's real money opportunities before. They usually involved him asking to borrow gas money 2 weeks later. The second week, Kyle's true colors started showing. Dishes in the sink became dishes on the coffee table, became dishes wherever Kyle happened to finish eating. The shower drain clogged with his hair. He started inviting his buddy Marcus over to watch games, and Marcus had the delightful habit of leaving cigarette butts in our flower pots. It's just temporary, Brooke kept saying whenever I brought up Kyle's increasingly relaxed interpretation of our house rules. He's going through a rough patch. Kyle had been going through a rough patch since the Clinton administration. The breaking point came on a Thursday night. I'd put in a 12-hour day at the shop, working on Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick that wheezed like a chain smoker climbing stairs. All I wanted was a shower, a beer, and maybe to watch something on TV that didn't involve grown men in uniforms chasing balls around a field. I walked into my house to find Kyle and Marcus sprawled across my living room like they owned the place. Empty beer bottles covered the coffee table, along with the remains of what looked like an entire pizza. The TV was cranked loud enough to wake anyone, showing some mixed martial arts fight where two guys were trying to pound each other into hamburger. "Hey, Tony," Kyle called without taking his eyes off the screen. "Grab us some more beers, would you? They're in the fridge." Not, "Thanks for letting me stay here." Not, "Sorry about the mess." Just an assumption that I'd serve him and his buddy like I was the hired help in my own home. "Get your own beer," I said. Marcus looked over for the first time, giving me the kind of stare you'd give something unpleasant you found on your shoe. He was one of those guys who thought a shaved head and a goatee made him look tough instead of like a thumb with facial hair. "Damn, Kyle," Marcus said. "Your brother-in-law's got an attitude." "Tony's just tired," Kyle said, finally looking at me. "Long day at the garage, right? Why don't you grab a shower and relax? We'll keep it down." The casual dismissal in his voice made something hot flare in my chest. This was my house, my living room, my TV. And Kyle was treating me like an inconvenience. "Actually," I said, "why don't you and Marcus take this party somewhere else? It's a weeknight." Kyle's expression shifted, and for a second I saw something ugly underneath his good old boy facade. "Come on, man. The fight's not over. We'll clean up. Now." The room went quiet except for the sound of two guys on TV trying to murder each other for sport. Marcus stood up slowly, making a show of how big he was. He had maybe 30 pounds on me, but 30 pounds of beer gut doesn't count for much in a real fight. "You heard him, Marcus," Kyle said, but his tone suggested I was being unreasonable. "Tony needs his beauty sleep." They left, but not before Marcus made sure to bump my shoulder on his way out. Real subtle. Kyle didn't say anything, just gathered up the empty bottles with exaggerated care, like he was doing me some huge favor. After they were gone, I started cleaning up the mess they'd left behind. Pizza grease on my coffee table, cigarette ashes ground into my carpet, beer rings on the end table that Brooke's grandmother had left her. That's when Brooke came home from her evening shift at the department store where she managed the women's clothing section. "Where's Kyle?" she asked, looking around the cleaned living room. "I asked him to take his party somewhere else." Her face changed, and not in a good way. "Tony, what did you do?" What did I do? Like I was the problem. Like it was unreasonable to expect basic respect in my own home. I came home to find Kyle and his buddy treating our living room like a frat house, so I asked them to leave. "He lives here now. This is his home too." "No, Brooke, this is our home. Kyle is a guest. There's a difference." She crossed her arms, and I recognized the pose. Battle stations. "Kyle is my brother. He's family." "And I'm your husband? What does that make me?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke from an engine fire. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Then Brooke's expression softened, but not in the way that meant she was backing down. It was the look she gave difficult customers at work, patient but condescending. "Tony, I know this is an adjustment, but Kyle really needs us right now. Can't you just try to get along with him?" Try to get along. Like I hadn't been trying. Like I hadn't bitten my tongue for 2 weeks while Kyle turned my home into his personal crash pad. I've been trying, Brooke. But Kyle isn't trying at all. He's treating this place like a hotel where the service is free and the staff is invisible. That's not fair, isn't it? When's the last time Kyle thanked either of us for anything? When's the last time he cleaned anything without being asked? Hell, when's the last time he even acknowledged that this isn't his house? Brooke was quiet for a moment, and I thought maybe I'd gotten through to her. Maybe she'd see that I wasn't being unreasonable, that I was just asking for basic consideration in my own home. Then she said, "Kyle got that job." "What job?" "The security firm. He starts Monday. Once he gets his first paycheck, things will be different." Another job, another fresh start. Another chance for Kyle to prove he wasn't the same guy who'd been disappointing people for the last 20 years. And my wife believed it, or at least wanted to believe it badly enough to keep making excuses for her brother's behavior. "Great," I said. "I'm happy for him." But I wasn't happy. I was tired. Tired of being the bad guy for expecting common courtesy. Tired of being outnumbered in my own home. Tired of feeling like a stranger in the life I'd built. That night, lying in bed next to my wife, I stared at the ceiling and listened to Kyle rummaging around in our kitchen, making himself a midnight snack. The refrigerator door opened and closed. Cabinets banged. The microwave hummed. Brooke was asleep or pretending to be. Either way, she wasn't bothered by the noise. I thought about transmissions again. about warning signs and slipping gears, and the moment when you realize that what you thought was a minor problem is actually a complete system failure. In the morning, I'd go back to my shop and fix other people's problems. I'd diagnose their troubles, order the right parts, and make everything work the way it was supposed to work. But some problems I was starting to realize can't be fixed with the right tools and enough elbow grease. Some problems require a complete rebuild. Kyle's new job lasted exactly 11 days. He came home on a Friday afternoon with that particular combination of defiance and self-pity that meant he'd either quit or been fired. And either way, it was everyone's fault but his. "Bunch of corporate bullshit," he announced, dropping onto our couch like a sack of cement. "They wanted me to work weekends. Weekends, Tony, like I don't have a life." I was in the kitchen, making myself a sandwich after another long day of actual work. Through the doorway, I could see Kyle reaching for the TV remote with the casual entitlement of a man who'd never met a responsibility he couldn't shirk. "What kind of security work doesn't include weekends?" I asked. Kyle's jaw tightened. "The kind where they treat their employees with respect. But what would you know about that? You've been turning wrenches in the same garage for 20 years. There it was, the real Kyle Maddox, the one who thought everyone else's job was beneath him while he bounced from one opportunity to another like a pinball with delusions of grandeur. "At least I've been turning wrenches for 20 years, I said. "Some people call that stability. Some people call it settling." I took a bite of my sandwich and counted to 10. Then I counted to 10 again. Kyle had a talent for finding exactly the right words to get under your skin, like a mechanic who knew just where to hit an engine to make it seize up. "So what's the plan now?" I asked. "I've got some leads. A couple of interviews lined up next week." Of course he did. Kyle always had leads. They just never seemed to lead anywhere except back to our couch. When Brooke got home that evening, Kyle had already spun his story into something resembling a victory. He hadn't been fired for showing up late 3 times in his first week. He'd realized the position wasn't a good fit for someone with his experience. He hadn't walked out during his lunch break. He'd made a strategic decision to explore better opportunities. And Brooke bought it, or pretended to. She made his favorite dinner and listened to his complaints about corporate culture and workplace politics like he was some kind of business guru instead of a 36-year-old man who couldn't hold a job checking IDs at an office building. "Maybe this is a blessing in disguise," she said, passing Kyle the mashed potatoes. "Maybe you're meant for something bigger." Kyle nodded sagely, like this was a profound insight instead of the same thing she'd said after his last 3 jobs had ended. "That's what I keep telling people. You can't think small in today's economy." I ate my dinner and wondered what it would be like to live in a world where failure was always someone else's fault, and every setback was really an opportunity in disguise. It sounded exhausting. After dinner, Kyle announced he was going out to network with some contacts. Networking, in Kyle's vocabulary, meant drinking beer with other unemployed guys and complaining about how the world didn't recognize their obvious talents. "Don't wait up," he told Brooke, kissing her cheek like she was his wife instead of his sister. After he left, I tried to talk to Brooke about setting some boundaries. Maybe Kyle needed to contribute more around the house if he wasn't working. Maybe we should set a timeline for how long he could stay. Maybe we should acknowledge that letting her brother turn our home into his personal unemployment office wasn't working out. "He just needs time to find the right opportunity," Brooke said, loading dishes into the dishwasher with unnecessary force. "Not everyone can be content fixing the same broken cars forever." The shot hit home, and she knew it. I'd been running Miller's Auto Repair for 15 years, ever since I'd bought out my old boss. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work, and it paid our bills, most months anyway. "Those broken cars pay our mortgage," I said. "I know that. I just think Kyle has bigger dreams." "Kyle's 36 years old, Brooke. At some point, dreams need to turn into reality." She slammed a plate into the dishwasher hard enough to rattle the other dishes. "Not everyone gets to give up on their dreams at 25, Tony." Give up on my dreams. Like choosing a stable career over chasing fantasies was some kind of character flaw. Like being responsible was something to be ashamed of. "What dreams did I give up?" I asked. But Brooke had already left the kitchen. That night, Kyle came home at 2 a.m, stumbling through the front door like a hurricane made of beer breath and bad decisions. He knocked over a lamp, swore loudly enough to wake the neighbors, and then spent 10 minutes trying to figure out how to work the microwave. I lay in bed listening to him destroy our kitchen while Brooke slept peacefully beside me, or pretended to sleep. Either way, she didn't seem bothered by the fact that her brother was treating our home like his personal crash pad. The next morning, I found Kyle passed out on the couch, still wearing his clothes from the night before. The coffee table was covered with empty beer bottles and the remains of what looked like a frozen burrito that had exploded in the microwave. There was salsa on the carpet, cheese on the couch cushions, and a smell that suggested Kyle had forgotten how toilets worked. I cleaned up the mess because the alternative was living in it, but I was done pretending this was temporary. Kyle wasn't looking for a job. He was looking for someone to take care of him while he figured out his next excuse for why the world owed him something better than what he was willing to work for. When Brooke came downstairs, she looked at Kyle sleeping peacefully in the wreckage of our living room and smiled like he was still the little boy she remembered instead of the grown man who couldn't function without someone cleaning up after him. "He's really trying," she said. "Is he? Don't start, Tony." But I was already started. "Brooke, look around. Really look. This isn't trying. This is Kyle doing exactly what Kyle always does, taking advantage of people who care about him. He's going through a rough time. When isn't Kyle going through a rough time? And why is his rough time always someone else's problem to solve?" Brooke's face flushed red, and for a moment I thought she was going to admit that I was right, that Kyle was a 36-year-old child who needed to grow up, not another family member to enable his dysfunction. Instead, she said, "Maybe if you tried to be more supportive instead of just criticizing everything he does, Kyle would feel more motivated." My fault. Somehow Kyle's inability to hold a job or show basic respect in our home was my fault for not being supportive enough. What would support look like, Brooke? Should I applaud when he gets fired? Should I thank him for leaving beer bottles under our couch? Should I be grateful that he's turning our living room into his personal man cave? You could try being his friend instead of treating him like a burden. I could try being his friend if he tried being a decent houseguest. We stared at each other across the wreckage of our kitchen, and I realized we weren't really arguing about Kyle anymore. We were arguing about something deeper, something that had been building for months before Kyle ever moved in. We were arguing about respect, about priorities, about what kind of life we wanted to build together, and whether we even wanted to build it together at all. Kyle chose that moment to wake up, stretching and yawning like he'd had a peaceful night's sleep instead of a drunken rampage through our home. "Morning, folks," he said, apparently oblivious to the tension in the room. "Anyone make coffee?" I looked at my wife, waiting for her to say something about the mess, about the noise, about the basic courtesy Kyle owed us as his hosts. Instead, she smiled and said, "I'll put a pot on." That's when I knew I was losing more than just my living room. I was losing my marriage. 3 weeks later, Kyle was still unemployed, still making messes, and still treating our house like his personal resort. But something else had changed. Something I didn't recognize at first because it was too ridiculous to believe. My friends had started avoiding me. It started with Dave Martinez, my buddy from high school who ran the parts supply store downtown. We'd been meeting for beers every Friday night for 10 years, but suddenly Dave was always busy. Had to work late, family obligations, his kid's soccer game. Then Tom Bradley stopped coming by the shop to shoot the breeze during his lunch breaks. Tom was an insurance adjuster who sent me a lot of business, and we'd developed a friendship over the years, built on mutual respect, and shared complaints about the idiots we had to deal with in our respective jobs. When I called Tom to ask if everything was okay, he was evasive. "Yeah, everything's fine, Tony. Just busy, you know? Lots of claims to process." But there was something in his voice, a careful distance that hadn't been there before. The third strike was when I showed up at Murphy's Tavern for the monthly poker game I'd been part of for 8 years, only to find out the game had been moved to Jake Sullivan's house, without me. "Oh shit, Tony," said Mike Chen, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "I thought someone called you." But nobody had called me, and the looks on the other guys' faces suggested this wasn't an oversight. I went home that night confused and angry, trying to figure out what I'd done to deserve the cold shoulder from guys I'd considered good friends. Had I said something offensive, borrowed money and forgotten to pay it back, slept with someone's wife? The answer came from an unexpected source, Rico Delgado, the 24-year-old kid who worked at my shop. Rico was a good mechanic with a bad habit of knowing everyone's business in a 6-block radius. "Boss," he said on a Monday morning while we were working on a transmission rebuild, "you know Kyle's been talking to your friends, right?" I looked up from the valve body I was cleaning. "What do you mean, talking to my friends?" Rico glanced around the shop like he was worried someone might overhear us. "My cousin Maria works at Murphy's. She says Kyle's been coming in there, buying drinks, telling stories about living with you and your wife." "What kind of stories?" "The kind that make you sound like a real asshole, boss." Rico laid it out for me, piece by piece. Kyle had been spending his unemployment checks at Murphy's, playing the role of the wronged brother-in-law who was just trying to get back on his feet while dealing with an unreasonable host. According to Kyle's version of events, I was a controlling husband who resented his success and took out my frustrations on anyone who threatened my small-town, small-minded worldview. He's got them thinking you're some kind of tyrant, Rico said. Says you make him follow all these crazy rules, won't let him have friends over, treat him like a servant in his own sister's house. His own sister's house. Not our house. Not my house. Brooke's house, where I was apparently just another occupant with no say in how it was run. He tell them about the job he lost? I asked. Oh yeah, but the way Kyle tells it, he quit because the boss was asking him to do things that weren't in his job description. Says he's got standards. Standards. Kyle Maddox, who'd been fired from more jobs than some people apply for, had standards. But the real knife twist came when Rico told me about Kyle's latest performance at Murphy's. He was there Saturday night, buying rounds, talking about how hard it is to live with someone who's given up on life. Says you married his sister and then stopped trying to be the man she deserves. The words hit me like a wrench to the gut. Kyle wasn't just bad-mouthing me to my friends. He was questioning my marriage, my manhood, my worth as a husband. And he was doing it with my money, since the unemployment checks he was spending came from jobs I'd helped him get through my connections. Boss? Rico was looking at me with concern. You okay? I wasn't okay. I was furious. But more than that, I was hurt. These were guys I'd known for years, guys I'd helped out when their cars broke down, guys I'd considered real friends, and they were ready to believe Kyle's bullshit without even asking for my side of the story. That evening, I confronted Brooke about her brother's extracurricular activities. Did you know Kyle's been spending his evenings at Murphy's, telling everyone what a terrible person I am? Brooke was folding laundry in our bedroom, and she didn't look up from the shirt she was working on. Kyle's allowed to have friends, Tony. He's not making friends, Brooke. He's making enemies for me. My friends are avoiding me because of the lies your brother's been spreading. Now she looked up, and her expression was more annoyed than concerned. What lies? I told her what Rico had told me about Kyle's version of our household dynamics and his commentary on our marriage. I expected her to be angry, to be embarrassed by her brother's behavior, to finally see Kyle for what he really was. Instead, she shrugged. Maybe Kyle's just frustrated. You haven't exactly made him feel welcome here. I haven't made him feel welcome. Brooke, I've let him live in our house for over a month, eat our food, use our utilities, and treat our living room like his personal clubhouse. What more does he want? He wants to feel like family instead of like a burden. Then maybe he should act like family instead of acting like a burden. Brooke set down the shirt she'd been folding and looked at me with the kind of patience you'd show a slow child. Tony, I know this is hard for you. You're not used to sharing your space, but Kyle is going through a difficult time, and he needs our support. Our support. Like I hadn't been supporting Kyle for weeks while he turned my friends against me and made a mockery of my marriage in public. What about my difficult time, Brooke? What about the fact that I can't go to my usual bar because your brother's turned it into his personal stage for trashing my reputation? You're being dramatic. Dramatic. My wife thought I was being dramatic because I didn't appreciate being slandered by the man I'd opened my home to. Am I? Dave won't return my calls. Tom won't come by the shop. I got uninvited from poker night, but I'm being dramatic. Brooke picked up another shirt and shook it out with unnecessary force. Maybe this is a good opportunity for you to make new friends. Branch out a little. Branch out. Like the problem was that I'd been too narrow in my social choices, not that Kyle was systematically destroying the relationships I'd built over years. That night, I lay in bed listening to Kyle come home from another evening of character assassination at Murphy's. He was singing some country song about heartbreak and redemption, loud enough to wake the neighbors, but apparently not loud enough to wake his sister. Brooke slept peacefully beside me, or pretended to. Either way, she wasn't bothered by the noise, just like she wasn't bothered by Kyle's lies, just like she wasn't bothered by the fact that her brother was destroying my social life one beer at a time. I stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out when I'd become the villain in my own life. When had wanting basic respect in my own home made me the bad guy? When had expecting my wife to prioritize our marriage over her brother's feelings made me unreasonable? But I already knew the answer. It had happened gradually, like a transmission slipping one gear at a time until suddenly you're stuck on the side of the road with no forward motion at all. The question now was whether this marriage could be rebuilt, or if it was time to start shopping for something completely new. In the kitchen, Kyle knocked over what sounded like a chair, swore creatively, and then laughed at his own clumsiness like it was the funniest thing in the world. Tomorrow, I knew, he'd tell his new drinking buddies another story about living with his uptight brother-in-law who couldn't take a joke. And they'd believe him because Kyle had something I'd never learned how to fake. the ability to make his problems sound like everyone else's fault. But every transmission has a breaking point, and I was starting to think I'd found mine. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in October when I walked into Murphy's Tavern and found Kyle holding court at my usual table, entertaining my former friends with another installment of Life with Tony the Tyrant. I hadn't planned to go to Murphy's. I'd been driving home from the shop when I saw Dave Martinez's truck in the parking lot, along with Tom Bradley's sedan and Jake Sullivan's motorcycle. My friends were all there, probably having the weekly gathering I was no longer invited to. On impulse, I pulled into the parking lot and sat in my truck for a moment, trying to decide what I wanted to accomplish. Part of me wanted to walk in there and confront Kyle directly, call him out in front of everyone and force them to hear my side of the story. Part of me wanted to just drive home and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But a bigger part of me was tired of being the reasonable one, tired of taking the high road while Kyle took everything else. I walked into Murphy's and immediately spotted them at the corner table where we used to play poker. Kyle was in the middle of what was obviously a well-rehearsed story, gesturing with his beer bottle for emphasis while Dave, Tom, and Jake listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for particularly good gossip. "So I'm trying to watch the game, right?" Kyle was saying. "Just trying to relax after a long day of job interviews, and Tony comes stomping in like he owns the place. Which, okay, technically he does, but you know what I mean, and starts screaming about beer bottles on the coffee table." "Beer bottles?" Tom asked. "2 beer bottles, man. 2. And he's acting like I burned the house down." I stood there for a moment, listening to Kyle's version of the night I'd asked him and Marcus to take their party somewhere else. In Kyle's telling, I was a raging maniac who'd thrown a tantrum over minor mess. There was no mention of the pizza grease, the cigarette ashes, or the fact that it was a weeknight and I'd just worked a 12-hour day. Dave shook his head sympathetically. "Man, that's rough. Your family." "That's what I keep telling Brooke," Kyle said. "But Tony's got this whole control thing going on. Like, he needs everyone to know he's the boss, you know? Probably compensating for something." Jake laughed, and the sound hit me like a slap. These guys had known me for years. They'd been in my home, met my wife, knew the kind of person I was. But they were ready to believe Kyle's bullshit without question. "The worst part," Kyle continued, "is what it's doing to my sister. Brooke's walking on eggshells all the time, trying to keep the peace. She deserves better than some controlling asshole who takes out his frustrations on her family." That's when I stepped forward. "Interesting story, Kyle. You want to tell them the rest of it?" The table went quiet. Kyle looked up at me with the expression of a man who'd just been caught stealing from the collection plate, but he recovered quickly. "Hey, Tony," he said, forcing a smile. "Didn't see you come in. Want to join us for a drink?" "I want you to finish your story. Tell them about Marcus grinding cigarette ashes into my carpet. Tell them about the pizza grease you left on my grandmother's coffee table. Tell them about coming home drunk at 2 a.m. and destroying my kitchen." Kyle's smile faltered, but only for a second. "Come on, man. We're just talking here. No need to get all worked up." "Worked up?" I looked around the table at my former friends, all of whom were suddenly very interested in their beer bottles. "Dave, how long have you known me?" Dave shifted uncomfortably. "Tony, look, we don't need to get into—" 15 years, I answered for him. 15 years. And in all that time, have I ever struck you as the kind of guy who'd throw a tantrum over 2 beer bottles? "People change," Kyle said quietly. "Marriage can be stressful. Sometimes guys take it out on whoever's convenient." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Kyle wasn't just calling me controlling, he was suggesting I was abusive, that I was taking out my marital frustrations on him, the innocent victim who just needed a place to stay. "You snake," I said. Kyle stood up slowly, and I realized he'd been hoping for this moment. He wanted me to lose my temper in front of everyone, wanted to prove that I was exactly the unstable, controlling asshole he'd been describing. "Easy, Tony," he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "No need for name-calling. We're all friends here." "Friends?" I looked around the table again. "Is that what we are? Because friends usually ask for both sides of a story before they decide who to believe." Tom Bradley cleared his throat. "Tony, maybe I should what, Tom? Maybe I should apologize for expecting basic respect in my own home. Maybe I should thank Kyle for spending his unemployment checks on drinks while he tells everyone what a terrible person I am." "You're proving my point, man," Kyle said, sitting back down with theatrical calm. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't handle anyone questioning your authority." "Authority?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Kyle, you've been living in my house for 6 weeks. In that time, you've lost 1 job, trashed my living room, alienated my friends, and turned my marriage into a battlefield." What exactly gives you the authority to judge how I handle anything? I'm family, Kyle said simply. Family doesn't keep score. No, Kyle. Family shows up, and family contributes. Family doesn't spend 6 weeks bad-mouthing their host to anyone who'll buy them a drink. The bar had gone quiet around us. Other patrons were turning to watch the show, and I could see Murphy himself behind the bar, reaching for the phone in case he needed to call the cops. Tony, Dave said carefully, why don't you sit down? Let's talk about this like adults. Like adults? I turned to Dave, and he flinched at whatever he saw in my face. Dave, when's the last time you called me? When's the last time any of you treated me like a friend instead of like some kind of domestic abuser you need to avoid? We just thought, Jake started. You thought what Kyle told you to think. You didn't ask questions. You didn't consider that maybe there were two sides to this story. You just decided that a guy you've known for years was suddenly the bad guy because some unemployed loser needed someone to blame for his problems. Hey, Kyle said, his mask finally slipping. Watch your mouth. Or what? You'll tell more lies about me? You'll find new ways to trash my reputation while living off my generosity? Kyle stood up again, and this time there was real anger in his face. Your generosity. Man, you act like letting family stay with you is some huge sacrifice, like you're doing us this massive favor by sharing your precious space. I am doing you a favor, Kyle. A favor you've repaid by turning my friends against me and making my wife think I'm some kind of monster. Maybe if you weren't such a tight-ass control freak, your wife wouldn't need to choose between you and her family. The words hit like a physical blow. Kyle wasn't just talking about the house rules or the mess or even the lies he'd been telling. He was talking about something deeper, something that had been building between me and Brooke for weeks. What did you say? Kyle smiled, and it was ugly. You heard me. Brooke's tired of walking on eggshells around you. She's tired of having to apologize for her family, tired of pretending she's happy with someone who gave up on life at 25. Kyle, Dave started, but Kyle was on a roll now. You want to know the truth, Tony? Brooke deserves better than some small-town mechanic who thinks changing oil is the height of ambition. She deserves someone who dreams bigger than the next transmission rebuild. I hit him. I didn't plan it, didn't think about it, didn't consider the consequences. 1 second, Kyle was standing there with that smug smile, talking about my wife like he knew her better than I did, and the next second, my fist was connecting with his jaw hard enough to send him stumbling backward into the table. The bar erupted, chairs scraped, voices shouted, and someone, probably Murphy, was definitely calling the cops now. Kyle recovered his balance and came at me with a wild swing that I ducked easily. He might have been bigger than me, but he was also drunk and soft from weeks of unemployment. I grabbed him by the shirt and shoved him against the wall hard enough to rattle the framed photos of Murphy's softball teams. You want to talk about my wife? I said, my face inches from his. Let's talk about how you've been poisoning her against me for weeks. Let's talk about how you've turned my marriage into your personal entertainment. Kyle tried to push me away, but I had leverage and 15 years of manual labor on my side. Get off me, you psycho. Tony! Dave was behind me now, along with Tom and Jake. Tony, let him go. The cops are coming. I looked into Kyle's face and saw something I hadn't expected. Fear. Real fear. For all his tough talk and his stories about my unreasonable behavior, Kyle had never actually thought I'd fight back. You're done, I told him. Done in my house, done with my friends, done turning my life into your personal soap opera. I let him go and stepped back. Kyle straightened his shirt and tried to salvage some dignity, but his hands were shaking and there was already a bruise forming on his jaw. You're crazy, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Brooke's going to hear about this. Good, I said. Make sure you tell her the whole story this time. The cops arrived 5 minutes later, but by then Kyle had decided he didn't want to press charges, probably because he knew that any investigation would reveal exactly who'd been doing what to whom for the past 6 weeks. Murphy banned me from the bar for a month, which was fair enough. I'd started a fight in his establishment, and he had a business to protect. But as I sat in my truck in the parking lot, watching Kyle limp out to his car while my former friends avoided eye contact, I realized something important had just happened. For the first time in weeks, I felt like myself again. I'd stopped being reasonable, stopped taking the high road, stopped trying to be the bigger man while smaller men walked all over me. And it felt good. The question now was, what to do with that feeling when I got home and had to face my wife. Brooke was waiting for me when I got home, and from the look on her face, Kyle had already called her with his version of events. Are you out of your mind? She said before I'd even closed the front door. You attacked my brother in a bar? I defended myself against your brother in a bar. There's a difference. Kyle said you hit him for no reason. I looked around our living room, taking in the beer bottles on the coffee table, the pizza box on the floor, the general disaster that had become our home's default state since Kyle moved in. No reason, I repeated. Right. Brooke followed my gaze and her jaw tightened. Don't try to change the subject. You hit my brother. Your brother has been systematically destroying my reputation for weeks, Brooke. He's turned my friends against me, made a mockery of our marriage in public, and treated our home like his personal crash pad. So yeah, when he started talking about what you deserve and how I'm not good enough for you, I hit him. He was defending me. He was using you as ammunition in his war against anyone who expects him to act like an adult. Brooke crossed her arms, and I recognized the battle stance. But there was something different this time, something harder in her expression that I hadn't seen before. Maybe Kyle has a point, she said quietly. The words hit me like a cold slap. What? Maybe I do deserve better than this. Better than coming home every day to tension and arguments and a husband who can't get along with my family. I stared at my wife, really looking at her for the first time in weeks. When had she stopped being on my side? When had she started seeing me as the problem instead of seeing Kyle's behavior for what it really was? Brooke, Kyle has been going through a rough time, and instead of helping him, you've been making everything worse. You've been hostile and unwelcoming and controlling, and now you've escalated to violence. Violence? I punched a guy who's been trashing me to everyone in town. That's not violence, that's consequences. It's assault, Tony. Kyle could press charges. But he won't, because he knows that any investigation would reveal what he's really been doing here. Brooke was quiet for a moment, and I thought maybe I was getting through to her. Maybe she was finally ready to see Kyle's behavior objectively instead of through the lens of family loyalty. Then she said, I think you should move out for a while. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from an engine fire. I felt something cold settle in my stomach, a recognition that we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. Move out, I repeated. Just temporarily. Until we can figure this out. Until you can figure out how to deal with your anger. My anger. Like I was the one with the problem. Like wanting basic respect in my own home was some kind of character defect that needed professional help. And Kyle stays? Kyle is family. This is his home too. His home. Not our home. Not my home. Kyle's home, where I was apparently just a guest who'd overstayed his welcome. I looked around our living room one more time, taking in 15 years of shared life. The couch we'd picked out together when we were newlyweds, the coffee table that had belonged to Brooke's grandmother, the TV we'd saved up for 3 months to buy. All of it felt foreign now, like props in someone else's life. You know what, Brooke? You're right. She blinked, clearly not expecting me to agree so easily. I am? Yeah, you do deserve better. You deserve a husband who'll let your family walk all over him. You deserve someone who'll smile and nod while your brother destroys his reputation and turns his friends against him. You deserve a man who'll apologize for expecting basic courtesy in his own home. Tony, the problem is, I'm not that guy. I'm the guy who thinks marriage means putting your spouse first, not third, behind your brother's feelings and your need to avoid conflict. I'm the guy who thinks family means mutual respect, not one-sided obligation. I headed toward the stairs to pack a bag, but stopped at the bottom step. One more thing, Brooke. When Kyle loses his next job, and he will lose his next job because Kyle always loses his jobs, remember this conversation. Remember how you chose him over me. And when he's still living here in 6 months, still making messes and excuses and enemies for you, remember that you had a choice. I packed quickly, taking only what I needed for a few days. Clothes, toiletries, the photo of my parents from my nightstand. Everything else could wait. Brooke was still standing in the living room when I came back downstairs with my bag. Where will you go? She asked, and for the first time that evening, she sounded uncertain. Rico's got a couch I can borrow until I figure things out. Tony, this doesn't have to be permanent. We just need some space to think. I stopped at the front door and looked back at my wife. She was beautiful, even now, even in the middle of choosing her brother over her marriage. But beauty wasn't enough anymore. Maybe it had never been enough. You're right, I said. This doesn't have to be permanent, but it's going to be. I left her standing there in the wreckage of our living room, surrounded by Kyle's mess and the consequences of her choices. 3 days later, I rented a small apartment above Chen's Electronics on Main Street. It wasn't much, 1 bedroom, tiny kitchen, a living room barely big enough for a couch and a TV, but it was mine. No one else's dishes in the sink, no one else's mess to clean up, no one else's drama to navigate. Rico helped me move my stuff, along with a few other guys from the shop who'd heard about what happened at Murphy's. Word travels fast in a small town, and apparently Kyle's version of events wasn't the only one making the rounds. "Boss," Rico said as we carried my dresser up the narrow stairs. "You know half the town's talking about this, right?" "Talking about what?" "About Kyle. Turns out you weren't the only one he was bad-mouthing. Guy's been making enemies all over town, telling different stories to different people. Some of them don't add up." I wasn't surprised. Kyle had always been a storyteller, and storytellers rarely let facts get in the way of a good narrative. "What kind of stories?" "Well, he told the guys at the unemployment office that he was living with his sick sister and her husband, helping them out while he looked for work. Told the bartender at O'Malley's that he was staying with friends who were going through a divorce and needed someone to mediate. Told some girl at the grocery store that he was house-sitting for his brother-in-law who was out of town on business." Different stories for different audiences. Kyle wasn't just lying about me, he was lying about everything, creating whatever narrative served his purposes in the moment. "People are starting to figure it out," Rico continued, "especially after what happened at Murphy's. Some of your old friends are feeling pretty stupid about believing his bullshit." "Too late now," I said, though I felt a small satisfaction knowing that Kyle's web of lies was finally catching up with him. "Maybe not, boss. Dave Martinez stopped by the shop yesterday asking if you were okay. Seemed like he wanted to apologize but didn't know how." I thought about Dave, about all the years of friendship that Kyle had poisoned with his stories. Maybe some relationships could be rebuilt, but they'd never be the same. Trust, once broken, leaves scars even after it heals. That evening, I sat in my new apartment with a beer and a frozen dinner, watching the sunset over the main drag of our small town. It was quiet in a way my house hadn't been in weeks, peaceful but also lonely. My phone buzzed with a text from Brooke. "Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time, trying to decide what I wanted to say. Part of me wanted to go home, wanted to try to rebuild what Kyle had helped destroy. Part of me missed my wife, missed the life we'd built together, missed the illusion that we were on the same team, but a bigger part of me remembered the look on her face when she'd told me to move out, the certainty in her voice when she'd said Kyle was family and this was his home too, the way she'd chosen his comfort over my dignity, his version of events over our marriage. I deleted the message without responding. Some engines can be rebuilt. Others are too damaged to save, and the smartest thing you can do is start over with something new. Outside my window, the town settled into evening quiet. Tomorrow, I'd go back to work, back to fixing other people's problems while I figured out how to fix my own life. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was moving forward instead of just spinning my wheels. And that was enough for now. 2 weeks after I moved out, Kyle got arrested for drunk driving. Rico brought me the news on a Monday morning, along with coffee and the kind of barely suppressed glee that comes from watching someone get exactly what they deserve. "Happened Saturday night," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk in the shop's tiny office. "Kyle was leaving O'Malley's, probably drunk as a skunk, and ran a red light right in front of a patrol car. I looked up from the invoice I was reviewing. Anyone hurt? Nah, just Kyle's pride and his driver's license. But get this, the car he was driving? Brooke's Honda. Of course it was. Kyle didn't have a car of his own, just like he didn't have a job, an apartment, or any other markers of adult responsibility. He'd been using Brooke's car like everything else in her life, as if it belonged to him. Brooke must be thrilled, I said. According to my cousin Maria, who works at the courthouse, Brooke had to take a day off work to deal with the whole mess. Bail, impound fees, lawyer consultations. Kyle's looking at losing his license for 6 months, minimum. I tried to feel some satisfaction at Kyle's downfall, but mostly I just felt tired. This was exactly the kind of crisis I'd been predicting for weeks, the inevitable result of Kyle's refusal to take responsibility for anything in his life. "She call you?" Rico asked. I knew he meant Brooke. "No." "Might want to change your locks anyway, just in case she decides to bring Kyle by to apologize or some shit." It was good advice. I'd been living in my apartment for 2 weeks, and Brooke still had keys to my shop. We hadn't talked about dividing property or formalizing our separation, partly because I kept hoping she'd come to her senses, and partly because I wasn't ready to admit our marriage was really over. But Kyle's arrest changed things. It was proof that I'd been right about him, validation that my concerns hadn't been unreasonable or controlling. If Brooke couldn't see that now, she never would. That afternoon, I called a locksmith. The next morning, Brooke was waiting for me when I arrived at the shop. She looked terrible. Her usually perfect blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. She was sitting in her Honda, the same Honda that Kyle had been driving when he got arrested, and when she saw me pull up, she got out and walked over with the careful movements of someone trying not to start a fight. "Hi, Tony." "Brooke." We stood there for a moment in the awkward silence of two people who used to share everything and now didn't know how to talk to each other. "I guess you heard about Kyle," she said finally. "Small town. Word gets around." She nodded, looking down at her hands. "He's really sorry about everything. The arrest, the things he said at Murphy's, the way he acted while he was staying with us." "Is he?" "He wants to make it right. Maybe you two could talk, work things out." I looked at my wife, my estranged wife, and saw the same pattern that had been playing out for months. Kyle screwed up, Brooke made excuses, everyone was supposed to pretend it was no big deal and move on. What would that look like, Brooke? Kyle apologizes, I accept. And then what? He moves back in and we pretend the last 2 months never happened? He's not moving back in. He's staying with a friend now. What friend? Brooke's face flushed slightly. Marcus. Marcus? Kyle's drinking buddy, the guy who'd helped trash my living room and then bumped my shoulder on his way out. The same Marcus who'd been part of Kyle's audience when he held court at Murphy's, telling lies about my marriage and my character. So Kyle's moved from our couch to Marcus's couch. That's not growth, Brooke. That's just changing locations. He's trying, Tony. He's got interviews lined up. He's looking into AA meetings. Stop. The word came out harder than I'd intended, but I was tired of this conversation before it even started. Brooke, Kyle's been trying for 20 years. He's been having interviews and making plans and turning his life around since before we got married. It never sticks because Kyle doesn't actually want to change. He just wants people to stop expecting him to change. That's not fair, isn't it? Name one time, when Kyle followed through on anything he promised. One job he kept for more than 6 months. One commitment he honored. One time when he took responsibility for his actions without blaming someone else. Brooke was quiet, and I could see her trying to come up with an example. The fact that she had to think about it proved my point. He's family, she said finally, falling back on the same argument she'd been using for months. So am I. Or I was. The words hung between us like a challenge. Brooke looked up at me with something that might have been regret, but it was too little and too late. Tony, I know I made mistakes. I know I should have supported you more, should have set better boundaries with Kyle. But we can fix this. We can go to counseling, work through our problems. What problems, Brooke? My problem was that your brother was destroying our home and our marriage, and you chose his side over mine. That's not a communication issue. That's not something we can fix with counseling. That's a fundamental difference in values. I chose family. You chose Kyle. There's a difference. Brooke's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I felt the old urge to comfort her, to take back my harsh words and try to find some middle ground where we could both be right. But I'd spent too many years being the one who compromised, the one who bent, the one who kept the peace at the expense of his own dignity. I miss you, she said quietly. I miss you too. I miss the woman I married, the one who used to be on my team, but that woman disappeared somewhere along the way, and I'm not sure she's coming back. She's right here, Tony. I'm right here. But she wasn't. The woman I'd married wouldn't have let her brother turn our home into a disaster zone. She wouldn't have made excuses for his lies and manipulation. She wouldn't have chosen his comfort over her husband's dignity. The woman I'd married had been my partner, not Kyle's enabler. I changed the locks, I said. Brooke blinked, clearly not expecting the subject change. What? The shop locks. I changed them. You can't just show up here anymore. Tony. And I'm filing for divorce. Papers should be ready next week. The words came out easier than I'd expected, like I'd been practicing them without realizing it. Brooke went pale, and the tears that had been threatening finally spilled over. You don't mean that? I do. This isn't working, Brooke. It hasn't been working for a long time. Kyle just made it impossible to pretend otherwise. What about for better or worse? What about forsaking all others? What about cleaving unto each other? Marriage vows work both ways, Brooke. You can't invoke the ones that benefit you while ignoring the ones that don't. She stood there crying in my parking lot, and I felt like the biggest bastard in the world. But I also felt something else. Relief. The decision was made. The pretending was over. I love you, she said. I know. I love you too. But love isn't enough when you don't respect each other, and you haven't respected me for a long time. Brooke wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself. So that's it? 14 years of marriage, and you're just giving up? I'm not giving up, Brooke. I gave up when I moved out. This is just making it official. She got back in her Honda and sat there for a moment, probably trying to think of something else to say, some argument that would change my mind. But there wasn't one. We'd said everything that mattered weeks ago when she'd told me to move out, and I'd realized that my wife saw me as the problem instead of seeing Kyle for what he really was. After she drove away, I stood in my parking lot for a long time, watching the morning traffic and thinking about the conversation I'd just had. It should have felt like an ending, and in some ways it did. But it also felt like a beginning. For the first time in months, I knew exactly where I stood and what I wanted. I wanted a life where I was respected, where my opinions mattered, where I didn't have to apologize for expecting basic courtesy in my own home. I wanted a life where I came first with the person who was supposed to love me most. Maybe that was selfish. Maybe that made me the controlling asshole Kyle had painted me as. But I was okay with that. Better to be selfish than to be a doormat. Better to be alone than to be with someone who saw you as the problem instead of the solution. I went inside and got back to work, fixing other people's problems while I finished rebuilding my own life from the ground up. It was going to be a good day. 6 months later, I was closing up the shop on a Friday evening when Dave Martinez pulled into my parking lot. I hadn't talked to Dave since the night at Murphy's, though Rico had mentioned that he'd been asking about me. Part of me had been curious about what he wanted to say, but a bigger part of me had been content to let sleeping dogs lie. Some friendships, once broken, aren't worth the effort it takes to fix them. But Dave got out of his truck with the determined look of a man who'd been working up the courage for this conversation for months, so I waited to see what he had to say. "Tony," he said, walking over with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. "You got a minute?" "Sure." We stood there in the awkward silence of two men who used to be friends and weren't sure how to talk to each other anymore. "I heard about the divorce," Dave said finally. "Word gets around." "Yeah." He kicked at a piece of gravel, not meeting my eyes. "Look, Tony, I came by because I owe you an apology, a big one." I didn't say anything, just waited for him to continue. "That night at Murphy's, the things Kyle was saying, I should have known better. I've known you for 15 years, man. I should have known you weren't the kind of guy who'd throw a tantrum over beer bottles on a coffee table." "But you believed him anyway." Dave winced. "Yeah, I believed him. We all did. And I've been feeling like shit about it ever since." "Why?" "Because Kyle's story never made sense. Not really. But it was entertaining, you know? And maybe..." He stopped, struggling with something. "Maybe part of me wanted to believe it because it made me feel better about my own problems at home." I looked at Dave more closely. He looked older than I remembered, more tired. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "What kind of problems?" "The kind where your wife spends more time at her sister's house than at home. The kind where you're working 60-hour weeks to pay for a lifestyle you can't afford while she complains that you're never around. The kind where you start wondering if you married the wrong person." I understood now. Dave hadn't believed Kyle's stories because they were convincing. He'd believed them because they made him feel less alone in his own marital struggles. So when Kyle painted you as this controlling husband who couldn't handle his wife's family, it felt familiar. It felt like something I might do if I was in your situation. "And now?" Dave laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Now I know the difference between being controlling and having standards. Kyle's been making the rounds, Tony. After you kicked him out, he tried the same shit with other people. Tom's brother let him crash for 2 weeks before Kyle got arrested again. Public intoxication this time. Jake's cousin hired him for a construction job that lasted exactly 3 days. Let me guess, everyone else's fault." "Of course. But people are starting to see the pattern. Kyle's not some misunderstood victim of circumstance. He's just a 36-year-old child who's never learned to take responsibility for anything." I felt a small satisfaction at hearing this, but it was tempered by the knowledge that it was too late to matter. My marriage was over. My friendships were damaged. Kyle's eventual exposure as a fraud didn't undo the damage he'd caused. "I'm sorry, Tony. Really sorry. I should have been a better friend." I looked at Dave, this man I'd known for half my adult life, and tried to decide what I wanted to say. Part of me wanted to tell him that his apology didn't matter, that the damage was done and couldn't be undone, but a bigger part of me was just tired of carrying anger around like a weight. "Apology accepted," I said. Dave's relief was visible. "Thanks, man. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I needed you to know that I know I screwed up." "What's going on with you and Linda?" I asked. "We're working on it. Counseling, mostly. Turns out I wasn't as innocent in our problems as I thought I was." He managed a rueful smile. Funny how listening to Kyle's bullshit made me take a hard look at my own behavior. Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to see clearly. Yeah, sometimes it takes watching a friend get screwed over to realize you don't want to be the kind of person who does the screwing. We talked for a few more minutes, carefully rebuilding the foundation of a friendship that had been damaged but not destroyed. It wasn't the same as it had been. There would always be the memory of those weeks when Dave had chosen Kyle's lies over our history, but it was something. As Dave was getting ready to leave, he paused by his truck. "You know Brooke's been asking about you, right?" I felt my stomach tighten. "Asking what?" "How you're doing, whether you're seeing anyone, whether you seem happy." "What do you tell her?" "The truth, that you seem better than you have in years." It was true. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks ago, and while it had been painful, it had also been liberating. I was sleeping better, eating better, enjoying my work again. I'd even started dating. Nothing serious yet, but it was nice to spend time with women who saw me as someone worth their attention instead of someone whose opinions needed to be managed. "She's not doing so well," Dave continued. "Kyle's living with her again. Lost his job at the construction company, got evicted from Marcus's place. Brooke's working double shifts to pay his bills." I felt a familiar stab of sympathy for my ex-wife, followed immediately by the recognition that this was exactly what I'd predicted would happen. Kyle would keep being Kyle, and Brooke would keep enabling him, and the cycle would continue until she finally got tired of being his mother instead of his sister. "That's not my problem anymore," I said. Dave nodded. "I know, I just thought you should know." After he left, I finished closing up the shop and drove to my apartment. It was small and simple, but it was mine. No one else's mess to clean up, no one else's drama to navigate, no one else's problems to solve unless I chose to solve them. I made myself dinner, watched a movie I actually wanted to watch, and went to bed at a reasonable hour without having to listen to anyone stumbling around my kitchen at 2 a.m. It was a good life, not the life I'd planned when I married Brooke 14 years ago, but a good life nonetheless. The next morning, I was having coffee and reading the paper when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Brooke's number, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello, Brooke?" "Tony." Her voice was strained, like she'd been crying. "I need to ask you a favor." Here it comes, I thought. Kyle's in trouble again, and she needs someone to bail him out, literally or figuratively. "What kind of favor?" "Kyle's in jail. He got arrested last night for violating his probation. Something about being drunk in public and resisting arrest. His bail is set at $5,000, and I don't have it." "I'm sorry to hear that, Brooke, but I don't see how that's my problem." "Please, Tony. I know you're angry with me, and you have every right to be, but Kyle's family. I can't just leave him in jail." "Sure you can. It's actually pretty easy. You just don't go to the bail bondsman." "That's not funny. It's not meant to be funny. It's meant to be true. Kyle's a grown man who made his own choices. The consequences of those choices aren't your responsibility." "He's my brother, and I was your husband. How did that work out for Kyle?" Brooke was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear her crying softly on the other end of the line. "I made a mistake, Tony. I chose the wrong person. I see that now." "Do you? Or do you just see that Kyle's problems are getting more expensive and you need someone else to help carry the load?" "That's not fair." "Isn't it? Brooke, you're calling me 6 months after our divorce became final, asking me to bail out the same brother who destroyed our marriage. If that's not proof that you haven't learned anything from this experience, I don't know what is." "I have learned. I've learned that I lost the best man I ever knew because I was too stupid to see what was right in front of me. The words should have felt good to hear, but they didn't. They felt like too little, too late." "I'm not bailing Kyle out, Brooke, and I'm not getting back together with you. That part of my life is over." "Tony?" "I hope you figure it out, Brooke, I really do, but you're going to have to figure it out without me." I hung up and turned off my phone. An hour later, I was under the hood of a 1967 Mustang that someone had brought in for a complete engine rebuild. It was going to be a beautiful car when I was finished with it. Classic lines, powerful engine, everything working the way it was supposed to work. Some things could be rebuilt. Others were too damaged to save. The trick was knowing the difference. I lost myself in the work. The familiar rhythm of disassembly and diagnosis and repair. Outside, it was starting to rain, but inside my shop, everything was warm and bright and under control. It was exactly where I wanted to be. 3 months later, Rico brought me the news that Kyle had been sentenced to 18 months in county jail for violating his probation. Brooke had finally stopped making his bail, and without anyone to enable his behavior, Kyle had run out of second chances. "Word is, Brooke's thinking about selling the house," Rico said. "Too many bills, not enough income." I felt a moment of sadness for the house where I'd spent 14 years of my life, but it passed quickly. That house had stopped being home long before I moved out. "Good for her," I said. Fresh start might be exactly what she needs. You think she learned her lesson? I thought about it while I torqued down the head bolts on the engine I was rebuilding. Had Brooke learned her lesson? Would she finally understand that love without boundaries wasn't love at all, but enablement? Would she recognize that family loyalty couldn't excuse destructive behavior indefinitely? Maybe. Or maybe she just finds someone else to rescue, some other lost cause to pour her energy into while neglecting the people who actually deserved her attention. Either way, it wasn't my problem anymore. I don't know, I told Rico, but I learned mine. Yeah, what's that? I looked around my shop, at the work that gave my life meaning, at the business I'd built with my own hands and my own determination. Then I thought about my apartment, small but peaceful, and the woman I'd been seeing for the past month, a teacher named Sarah who laughed at my jokes and respected my opinions and never made me feel like I was the problem. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is stop trying to save them. Rico nodded like this was profound wisdom, but it wasn't really. It was just common sense that had taken me 43 years to learn. Outside, the sun was shining, and I had a full day of work ahead of me. Good, honest work that would leave me tired but satisfied, the kind of tired that comes from accomplishment instead of exhaustion. I went back to my engine rebuild, humming an old song I couldn't quite remember the words to. Life was good,